Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Something relatively more common for today. It's a coin in an area where a lot of people who start collecting in the West generally gravitate towards because these are generally much more affordable and they're fairly common. But every so often you get a nice variety, and I'm like, hey, why not pick this up? So I will explain the tagline for this video shortly, but let's start by taking a look at the coin. So this is a coin of the Roman Emperor Flavius Gratianus, who was technically emperor from 367 to 383, but really until 375 he was ruling as a co-emperor with his father, so he was not really independent. It's a bronze coin, and that's what the AE is for, 21 millimeters, and it's 4.53 grams, so a decent sized bronze coin. On the obverse, you have the emperor facing towards the right with a pearled diadem and a draped cuirassed bust. And the legend goes DN Gratianus PF Augustus AVG. And the reverse has the legend Reparatio Reippvb REPVB. Obviously, the Romans still didn't have the letter U at the time in Latin. And the emperor is standing facing head left, and he's raising a kneeling woman with the right hand. And he has Nike, which is victory, on a globe in the left. Now, this reverse itself is sort of like a propaganda piece trying to talk about the restoration of the community. Because what's happening in the Roman Empire at this time, and this coin is issued between 378 and 383, and I'll get to what happens shortly. The Roman Empire is under a lot of threats from the movement of Germanic peoples on the Danube and the Rhine frontiers, and this is a time of deep uncertainty for the empire. And the Romans were past masters at basically putting propaganda on their coins. And so this you very often see on the reverses with images like legends to try to boost morale. The coin itself, it's a bronze, but it has a nice brown patina on it, which is part of the reason I picked it up. I do love coins that are sort of toned like chocolate, and it's a nice, pretty piece and in pretty good shape. So let's do our usual comparison to George, and let's talk about what is an AE2, which is often how this is described. So you can see this is slightly smaller than a quarter. It is, as I said, 21 millimeters. Part of the issue is we don't really know what these late Roman bronzes were called. They're generally referred to as folii, F-O-L-I, folii, or they might actually be nummi. We're not sure. So what we do is we distinguish them in numismatic circles by the size. So an AE1 is something more than 25 millimeters. AE2 is 21 to 25. And then you have an AE3, which is, I think, 17 to 21, and then or 15 to 21, and it's anything smaller than AE4. And so at this period in the decline of the Roman Empire, you're still seeing a decent amount of AE2s. And what's going to happen in the next 20 to 30 years is the AE2s and the AE1s are pretty much going to disappear. And pretty much everything is going to be an AE3 and then eventually pretty much an AE4 in the bronze coinage, because the empire is going to go through a lot of economic strain and they're just not going to have the resources to mint the bronze coins. And so that is going to make a change in the circumstances. So that is the coin, and just a quick overview of Gratian. He was elevated by his father Valentinian I as co-emperor in 367, and then his father died in 375, basically had a blood vessel burst after he was ticked off at the way visiting Germanic embassy was acting. The emperor lost his temper, burst a blood vessel, and then he was dead. And it was unfortunate because Valentinian was actually a very competent military emperor. And that left the 16-year-old Gratian as the emperor of the West. His uncle Valens was emperor in the East, his Valentinian's younger brother. And by this point, this was very common in the Roman Empire. Starting with Diocletian, the emperors, and actually a little earlier actually in the reign of Valerian, the emperors had realized that one emperor could not really hold everything together. especially when you're facing threats along the Danube and the Rhine, not to mention stuff in Britain and sometimes along the eastern border with Persia. And so pretty much after the death of Constantine, it became common. Constantine actually conquered and unified the empire over a bunch of other challengers. But it was pretty clear that an emperor after that is going to put some relative as a co-emperor. And that's what Valens was. Unfortunately, for the 16-year-old Gratian, in 376, a bunch of generals of the army of the Danube decided to put his 4-year-old half-brother as Emperor Valentinian II. So now the empire has 3 emperors. And Gratian eventually accepted this on the condition he is the senior emperor in the West. And the image on the right is an image I got online of a medal by Valens, which shows the 3 emperors together. Now, Valentinian II was still a child, and his mother and the generals around her were the ones ruling his little portion of the empire. And then things got worse. In 378, Valens was defeated and killed at the Battle of Adrianople, along with much of the Eastern Empire's field army, which is one of the critical moments that eventually led to the collapse of the empire. That left Gratian as the senior emperor and in charge. And obviously, realizing he couldn't do it all on his own, in 379, he selected the Spanish general Theodosius as the emperor of the East. And Theodosius's job in the next few years was to stabilize the situation in the Balkans, because the Goths, after the Battle of Adrianople, were basically running amok. So I mentioned that bronze coin a little while back with that reverse about the restoration of community and the Republic, even though we're still not really a Republic at this point. And that is part of the propaganda, where the emperor is trying to show that all is well, stay calm. Now to the connection of our tagline. The Gallic city of Qualaro, I'm probably butchering the name, in 381, Gratian had helped establish a bishopric in the city, and the city itself had been elevated to a city from a village to a city in the 290s. And the image you see are the surviving Roman walls in the city. So in 381, the city, in honor of the emperor, renamed itself Gratianopolis. And that name evolved over time in Middle Ages to Grenoble, and that eventually has evolved to the model Grenoble, and which is why I use the tagline Grenoble's Emperor. And there are a few cities in Europe that still bear the names of Roman emperors. Orleans in France, named after the Emperor Aurelian, is one of them. And this actually is one I had not realized until I was preparing this video. The other thing Gratian is known for, he was a very pious Christian emperor, and along with Valentinian II and Theodosius, the 3 Augusti, which is his emperors, issued what is now called the Edict of Thessalonica, which accepted Nicene Christianity as the primary religion of the empire. Now, this is often presented as an attack on paganism, and it was, but my guess is this was actually directed more at other Christian sects, notably Arianism. Won't get too deep in the weeds here, but basically Arianism, the Christian church had a debate about, when Jesus is the Son of God, was he born a God, or did God raise his son to divinity? Rather esoteric discussions, and people actually killed each other over this, but the so-called Arian heresy was very popular in the East, and Valens actually had been an Arian, and so was Gratian's stepmother. And Theodosius himself, being very orthodox, probably wanted to crack down on this, and that is probably the primary motivations of this edict, to make Nicene Christianity the primary religion of the empire. But this had its effect on the pagans as well, because Gratian cut off support of various pagan temples, reduced the official status of the Vestal Virgins in Rome, and there was a lot of protest from the Senate over this. But so you can read what the edict says. Gratian appears to have been an active military emperor. He was not a total slacker, but unfortunately, he appears to have alienated the army while battling along the borders against the Alemanni. There were a bunch of Alan deserters that he took into his army, and he made them his bodyguard, and he was accused of favoritism. And at least that seems to have been the excuse for the army in Britain to elevate Magnus Maximus, the general, as emperor. When Maximus invaded Gaul, Gratian's army deserted, forced to flee. He was killed at the town of Lugdunum, what is modern Lyon, in August 383. And I've left that number out in there while typing this up. Ironically, the childless Gratian, he was still deified, and this continued up into the middle of the 4th century. Even though the empire is Christian, the old imperial cult continued, and he was actually deified by the Senate. And Gratian had been married twice. His first wife was the posthumous daughter of the Emperor Constantius II, one of the sons of Constantine. He had no children, and she had died earlier in the year, and he had just got married again, and he left no children. And so that left Theodosius as the senior emperor, with the young Valentinian still in Italy, and the new usurper in the West. And you would have a series of civil wars over the next 15 years, 12 years, until eventually Theodosius I would be briefly the last sole emperor of the whole Roman Empire. So it was, as I said, this is not a coin I collect that often. I'll do it sporadically if I see a really nice example. The late Roman bronzes, because of the cost, is something where most collectors start, and then they discover nicer and more exciting stuff. But it's an interesting area. There's a lot of propaganda on the coins. You can still get nicely struck coins for relatively cheap. The portraiture is now lacking because this is all idealized portraiture, so nobody really thinks the emperors look like this. So that is a downer. But anyway, that's it for today. And if you like this video, please hit subscribe and the bell icon, and you will be notified when the next video loads. See you soon.
I'm sick and tired of living in a van down by the